You're listening to Better Live Than Dead.
How's it going, everybody? Another BLTD Extracast coming at you live right now. I'm Ryan Wolfe, at Wolfe BLTD on Twitter. Joining me now, very good friend of the podcast, an original member of the BLTD Megacast. We have some very special people on the line today. We got Chris Ostrander from Two in the Box. He's at 2ITB_Buffalo on Twitter. A very good follow. You can also check out his website, twointhebox.com. Chris, how you doing tonight, man?
Doing pretty well. How about you?
I'm doing good. Glad to have you. Glad to be talking some hockey. I know I've been talking a lot of today. I talked some baseball, and I know I'm going to be talking some football later. And I'm excited to have kind of a hockey middle of the s'more, I guess. You know, the nice, comfortable, delicious middle of the day of podcasting hockey.
I'm happy to help. You know, pitchers and catchers reported, right? So,
dude, I'll tell you what. I talked to, and this is going to be going up all at different times. But I just talked to a guy from Barstool Sports earlier about baseball. And then, like, for a minute, I'd forgotten about hockey. And I'm like, oh, yeah, pitchers and catchers report today. But, like, there's still a whole ton of hockey to be played.
There is a lot.
But for us, the most exciting part, right now, just for record-keeping purposes, as I always say on the BLTD podcast, it's the 17th of February right now. So 12 days away from now, sooner when you hear this podcast, I do imagine, it will be the NHL Trade Deadline. And for as many years as we can remember now, the Buffalo Sabres are going to be dealing pieces. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, Chris. I want to kind of get your thoughts. I know you've been writing a ton of good stuff over at twointhebox.com. Check that out if you get a chance. But first off, the real big question I have for you is just kind of broad, like paint with a broad stroke here, and we can go in depth a little more after you answer the question. But what do you expect the Buffalo Sabres to do here at the deadline in a couple weeks?
I think the short and easiest answer is to sell. You know, they're certainly in a position at this point where you know they're a fair ways out of any sort of even realistic race to the playoffs, and just in terms of where they're in terms of the rebuild, they're still very much in a position where they're going to be selling off their veterans and their you know, expiring contracts. So they'll certainly be selling come the 29th. And I think almost everyone's been probably pointing in that direction at this point, I'd have to say.
Now, are there any we have the usual suspects, you know, the guys like Josh Georges, potentially we've heard some talks about Cody Franzen being dealt, and obviously Jamie McGinn with him being an unrestricted free agent after the season. But is there anybody on the team right now that that maybe you're not surprised that they would get dealt, but the average fan sees player X get dealt and goes, oh, I didn't know he was available?
I would actually probably put Georges in that category. And it kind of does depend on how closely you follow the trade chatter and all that stuff. But, you know, obviously he still has some term left on his deal. He certainly still has plays a fairly large role on the team, you know, being on the quote-unquote top pairing with Rasmus Ristolainen. But as I mentioned, you know, depending on how closely you follow some of the trade chatter and rumors, he has been connected to the LA Kings a fair bit. He's been talked about as a guy that some of these teams out west, in particular out west, might look at to help strengthen their defensive depth. So it wouldn't shock me if Georges was dealt. That might surprise some people. Another player, I think, and I do think his injury probably alters his ability to be moved. But another player would have been Tyler Ennis. I don't know if he'll be healthy enough to be a realistic trade chip at the deadline, but he's a guy I could easily see Murray moving on from for two reasons. One of which simply being that he carries value. You know, everyone's seen how talented he is and what he can bring to a team. So it's not as if he's a you know, just an expiring contract and you're just going to get a pick for him. You know, he carries some real value in a hockey trade scenario. And then the other reason is I simply don't know where he fits on the team as it stands today and moving forward. You know, he's a small water bug player. He certainly is creative and dangerous, but you know, they have a couple other creative and dangerous players in the pipeline on the roster and potentially coming through the draft again. So when it comes to strengthening the team, I could see very easily Tyler Ennis being the sacrificial lamb in a sense to help them maybe acquire another high-end defenseman, for example, or perhaps find someone that maybe fits Tim Murray's ideal mold up front.
Now we have, as you and I, obviously we're on Twitter a ton, but for the people that aren't on Twitter a lot, there has been some chatter that the Sabres may try to make a relatively decent sized move at the deadline to improve their defense, or maybe even add a depth winger that will help them out in the future. Do you think that's a move that will happen in February, or do you think that's a move that happens probably in June at the draft?
Going back to what I just mentioned about Ennis, I think it probably forces any sort of trade in that sense to be moved to the draft day floor. And if that's the case, so be it. Actually, you almost would think in terms of a PR perspective, if Gary Bettman's going to the draft podium to say we have a trade to announce in front of what I can only assume is going to be a sold-out First Niagara Center, that place is going to go bonkers. So, if Tim Murray has to wait, I don't think he's going to be hurting himself. I certainly think if there's any one hockey trade, if there's any one, if there's a move that he's going to make that's going to make a splash, it would be for a defenseman, like you said. So I'm certainly on board for that train of thinking. And I would hope that, that would happen sooner rather than later, just so you get a chance to see these guys. Just thinking back to last year, getting a chance to see Zach Bogosian a handful of times. Knowing that these guys are in the system just that much longer, I would certainly like to see it happen on the 29th. But I don't know what type of currency Murray is going to have to work with to make a trade like that.
Now, are you surprised at all? Because we heard Tim Murray talk on WGR a few weeks ago, and he said that he spoke to Dan Bilesma, he spoke to the team and said, look at, and now obviously, just for prefacing, we all know what the Sabres are doing here. The Sabres are trying to build and get more pieces to build the foundation better, so when they actually are ready to challenge for the playoffs, they have a solid team. But Tim Murray said, for those who didn't catch it, he told Dan Bilesma essentially, you have 2 weeks or so to prove to me that you're a playoff team. And since that's happened, the Sabres have not performed very well. Does it surprise you that Buffalo is continually having growing pains, or is this obviously just part of the overall picture and the overall growth of this team?
No, I think I think it's foolhardy to put on blinders and just say, all is well. This is all part of the process. There's nothing to be concerned about. I also think it's very foolhardy to really dwell on the fact that they are still floating near 30th place. I know there are a couple points up on it at the moment, but, I think, some of the concern and consternation that's been put out there by a handful of people about the fact, they're just not making progress, and then all the concern about that. I think that's a little short-sighted as well. I wasn't prepared to see them continually take one step forward and then 2 steps back. And I think that's been kind of an underlying factor in the entire season. I think, and I believe that the newspaper today mentioned it, that last night was the 5th or 6th opportunity to win a 3rd game in a row this season that they've fettered away. And that's tough. And at least in this case, it wasn't as if they played terribly as they did in Philadelphia last week, but or 2 weeks ago, depending on when people are listening to this. But I think that just the general lack of consistency has been frustrating, and I do think the general lack of success in the standings as a result has been frustrating. But they're relatively close to what I thought they would be this year. I think if you entered with realistic expectations, they're probably closer to meeting your expectations than they are from missing them, especially once you get to game 82 and you see how the dust is settled.
Now, it's been frustrating. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it. This season has been difficult for people because expectations, unfortunately, for people who are unrealistic. I know you and I, among others, are quite. We try to stay realistic. The Sabres win, a couple games here, a couple games there. We go, maybe they're turning the corner, but obviously you have to keep it all into perspective. And it has been a very difficult season for fans who expected Stanley Cup playoffs to happen right now. But it's hard not to get excited when you see Jack Eichel and Sam Reinhart are on pace. Don't want to jinx it, but they're on pace to become the first pair of Sabres rookies in 40 plus years to have 20 goals in a season. I mean, that tells you, or should show you, that what they're doing is working. It's just taking some time because it takes time to, they have the top half of the lines figured out. They have to figure out the bottom half, and that's where we're at. It's no longer are they trying to find depth guys. They're not trying to find those top six. They have the top six. Now they need to find the bottom six, and that's the process we're at right now when people just don't want to be patient.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it. I think anyone, realistic or unrealistic expectations entering the season could probably agree that they were at least a couple players away. Maybe one more really quality top six forward and one more top four defenseman, potentially a top two defenseman, but beggars can't be choosers there. But if you were maybe a little bit more realistic, maybe you think they're 3 players away, and I think that's where they are today. And even if Jamie McGinn is traded, they're still going to be 3 players away. I mean, as valuable as I think he's been to them this season, when the team really turns the corner, he'll go from a first-line player to probably a utility player in a sense of being able to play either on the second or third line, and in the fourth line if they really need him to. But realistically, you want him on your second or third line, not holding down first-line minutes, so to speak. So, they're certainly a couple players away. And I don't know if they're going to be able to pull down a hockey trade at this deadline to make it, to take that number down from 2 or 3 to 1, But they're a lot closer than I think a lot of people are probably thinking, especially those of us who are frustrated. Like you said, Reinhart and Eichel are obviously bright, shining stars. Ryan O'Reilly's obviously been a very, very impressive addition, and Vander Kane has played very well this last week or two, and he's been a nice addition as well. So, the pieces are there. There's a couple more complementary pieces that they need to get, and they'll be really close to being where they need to be. And then, of course, they're young too. I think that's probably being overlooked in some respects as well.
Now, this is more of a personal question because I don't really dislike Marcus Foligno. I am to the frustrated fans to the Sabres not being the playoffs this year is me with Marcus Foligno, because I see what he does on the ice, like the most recent stretch of games where he has been what we thought he could be. And then he falls off the map for 20, 30 games. Do you think Foligno is one of those guys that could be part of the future plan, or do you think he's a guy like Ennis that can be put in a package to get a better player to come back to Buffalo?
Me personally, I would probably consider moving him. I am not a huge fan of his game. I think you don't need to look any further than what Jamie McGinn does on a nightly basis to see a player who's a little bit more consistent in playing the role that he's meant to play. I think, like you said, Foligno does, go away at times. He kind of disappears, and I think that has a lot to do with, sometimes the physical side of his game dissipates, and as a result, his impact on the game dissipates. And I just don't know, I know he's a left winger, and I know he can play a little center, which is obviously helpful with a guy who's capable of playing along the middle there. But, Nick Delorier has certainly proven he's a very good fourth-line player. He'll probably be the Sabres' fourth-line winger for a little while longer here. And I would be surprised if his salary demands get outrageous. So they might have, kind of struck gold with that acquisition. You probably want to see a player like Jamie McGinn in that third-line role. And if that's the case, where does Marcus Foligno go then? Is he a healthy scratch? Is Delorier a healthy scratch? Is he playing in the rotation? So quite frankly, I think if you're able to get value for him on the open market, if you have teams that like his measurables and have seen him fight now just recently, have seen him score a few goals, maybe you're able to get someone to bite on him. I'd certainly explore that option, just simply because I think the Sabres have some better options on their way up, or at least even on the current roster.
Now, this is the last question I have for you, Chris. We'll let you go on this one. But you yourself are a goaltender. We see you talking a lot about goalies on Twitter at 2ITB_Buffalo. It's a cheap plug right there. Robin Lehner hasn't been back for long, so the sample size is very small. But from what you've seen so far, good and bad games included, have you been impressed with what Robin Lehner's brought to the table? You know what? It's funny that you ask this because as someone who's never been a fan of his, just in terms of big picture,
he's far exceeded my expectations. I've actually been I think comparing to where I was with him entering the season, to the level he's played at, he's far surpassed any expectations I had for him. And again, the sample size is small. His record doesn't really reflect the way he's been playing. I know at one point he was getting about 1.5 goals per game from his teammates. And whether or not your name's Dominic Hasek, you're probably not going to win too many games getting 1 goal in terms of goal support, or 1.5. But he's been good. He's a big guy. He's not fluid like Ryan Miller was, so it's awkward to watch him play. He's not a big blocking goaltender like, and I don't want to completely categorize him like Lundqvist in this light, but a blocking goaltender like Lundqvist or even Roberto Luongo, these guys who play a little deeper in the net. He's a very much a hybrid goaltender, and he doesn't do it, like I said, he doesn't do it gracefully. So he can be hard to watch at times. He's been effective, and he's made some big saves. I mean, even looking back to the Ottawa game where they just lost in the shootout, he didn't look great in the shootout, but he made a tremendous glove save late in the game there to help preserve at least that loser point. And he made a couple of other big saves throughout the game in general. And he's done that in the few games that he's been back. So it's not as if he's, making the routine saves and still losing games 3 or 4 to, 1 or 2, whatever it might be. He's showing some very impressive signs of progress. And I think, they at least have a quality player to build with. I wouldn't say you build around him. I don't know if he fits that mold yet. Maybe he proves everyone wrong and he becomes a real cornerstone. But you can build with him. You don't have to worry about recycling in net again. And as well as Chad Johnson's played it, if Chad Johnson was their starter, they'd be worried about what the next step is in goal. And I think Leonard gives them enough stability to be confident going forward in the next year at the very least. And maybe after next season, Linus Ullmark will be another year older. He'll have another year under his belt. He'll even have some more NHL time under his belt. And maybe then Tim Murray has to make a decision. But as hard as it is to ignore the fact that they gave up a first-round pick for him, if you're able to do that and just look at the way he's contributed, you've got to be pretty happy with him.
Well, Chris, again, I want to say thank you for joining us tonight on BLTD Extracast. I know we'll talk sometime soon because we're gonna have that new BLTD MegaCat hashtag 2.0. We'll get there. It's gonna happen slowly but surely. We're getting there. But again, everybody listening in podcast world, Chris Ostrander at 2ITB_Buffalo 2inthebox.com. Follow him on Twitter. Check out the page. He's got some great stuff going up, especially with the deadline coming up, like I said. Chris, thank you again for joining me. And like I said, we'll look forward to talking to you sometime soon.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on. It was a pleasure.